Director of the George Washington University Regulatory Studies Center. Is the mic on? Or even with the mic on, I have to shout. I think my voice tends not to carry. So I'm Susan Dudley, and from the George Washington University, I'd like to welcome you here for this event. I direct the Regulatory Studies Center in the Trachtenberg School of Public Policy and Public Administration. And with the GW Center for Risk Science and Public Health, we're really happy to be here to co-host this event with the Council on Agricultural Science and Technology and the Society for Risk Analysis. The GW Regulatory Studies Center works to improve regulatory policy through research, education, and outreach. And this particular project, I think, is very interesting, and so we were pleased when Linda Schimenti, who I'm going to introduce in 2 seconds, asked us if we'd like to co-host this event. So that's the end of my introduction. Then Linda Schimenti, who is the Executive Vice President of the Council on Agricultural Science and Technology, will speak, and then Sally Kane, who's the head of the National Capital Area Chapter of the Society for Risk Analysis, will make a few remarks and start moderating.
Thank you, Susan. As Executive Vice President of the Council for Agricultural Science and Technology, best known by its acronym, CAST, I'll add my words of welcome and thanks to all of you for attending our program this afternoon. I would like to thank the members of the panel, whom you'll meet in just a little while, for agreeing to participate in this event. And I'd like to thank especially Dr. Linda Abbott, Director of the Office of Risk Assessment and Cost-Benefit Analysis at USDA, for facilitating this collaborative effort. It was in an informal discussion I had with Linda that the idea came forward for this panel discussion, and I owe her my special thanks. And I want to give thanks and recognition to our co-sponsors, the Regulatory Studies Center here at George Washington University, and the National Capital Area Chapter of the Society for Risk Analysis. It's my pleasure this afternoon to tell you briefly about CAST, especially for those of you who may not be familiar with us. CAST is a nonprofit organization founded more than 40 years ago to assemble and distribute information about agricultural science and technology. Although CAST has its headquarters out in the heartland, Ames, Iowa, it got its start right here in Washington, D.C., when in 1970, the National Research Council of the National Academy of Sciences formed a planning committee to discuss the role of agricultural scientific societies. The following year, representatives from 16 scientific societies met to discuss forming a new organization and decided on its name. And by 1972, CAST was chartered and began its long history of publications that are disseminated widely to policymakers, regulators, the media, and the public. Now fast forward 41 years. CAST is still based in Ames, Iowa, and we are still assembling teams of volunteer scientists to write and peer review our publications. But we are still also a presence in Washington, and happy to be here. To date, CAST has published more than 400 documents on topics of animal science, biotechnology, energy and biofuels, food safety and nutrition, and plants and soils. Our output ranges from comprehensive task force reports to briefer commentaries, and to our newest series, the one-page Ag Quickcasts. In recent years, CAST has broadened our output to include translations of selected publications and professionally produced videos that are available through the CAST website and other online resources. And of course, like so many other groups, we are using social media to make our information available to a wider and, dare I say, younger audience who expect to find the answers quickly. So we are there with an upgraded website, blogs, Facebook, Twitter, Pinterest, YouTube, and SchoolTube. CAST is a membership organization. We're composed of scientific societies, but we also have individual members and student members, company, nonprofit, and associate society members. We have members in the U.S. and throughout the world. Some of you may be familiar with our signature Friday Notes. This is our electronic newsletter, published 48 times a year. Each edition has about 60 agricultural news items selected from more than 100 sources. Our editors go through every week finding those news items they think will appeal to our audience and our stakeholders. We have an international news section as well as animals, crops, food areas. And we have updates on what's going on in Washington, D.C. And then our newest initiative, as I mentioned, are the Ag Quickcasts. These are a series of one-page documents, concise, easy to read. Each one is excerpted from an existing CAST publication. So the full-length document is available through links on the Quickcast. And these are all free of charge on our website. We hope they will be especially useful to our Legislative Hill staff colleagues. We're here in Washington today to release our newest CAST issue paper. It's titled The Impact of the Precautionary Principle on Feeding Current and Future Generations. Dr. Gary Marchant, a panelist here, served as the chairperson of the task force that wrote and reviewed this publication. Earlier today, Dr. Marchant gave a presentation at two different venues, at the Senate for Senate staffers, and at the Lunch and Learn NC-FAR seminar hosted by the National Council for Food and Agricultural Research. And now Dr. Marchant is here to share highlights of the paper with you, and then to discuss this timely topic with the other experts who have agreed to join our discussion. And so with that, and my thanks again, I'm going to turn the program over to Dr. Sally Kane, President of the National Capital Area Chapter of the Society for Risk Analysis. Sally?
Hi, good afternoon. Okay, I'll come closer to the microphone. It's a pleasure to be here. We have a very strong relationship with various centers on campus. One is Susan Dudley's Center for Regulatory Studies, George Gray's Center, the Environmental Law Studies Program, and our latest partner is CAST. And I'm personally really happy to be a part of the event. With CAST, I came in to Washington, D.C. as a new professional, and I came into the Economic Research Service of USDA. CAST reports were always very rigorously done and timely. So it's nice to be a part of this venue. Thanks very much. The Society for Risk Analysis has several regional organizations. Here in Washington, it's called the National Capital Area Chapter. Given the size of the audience, I'm remiss if I don't say just a few words about the chapter. We have programming through the year. We represent, collect people from industry, academia, laboratories, practitioners, and we welcome everybody to come in. It's a $10 membership. Pardon me. I'm not the only person here from the chapter. I want to introduce people here in the audience just very quickly. Dr. T. Gadati. There's T. He is a counselor. Susan, of course, is a active member. Dr. Linda Abbott, in the back there, is a liaison from USDA. We have Dr. Jenny Dana, who is Officer of Programming and Secretary. Let's see, have I missed anybody here? Else? That are the officials. Okay. What I'd like to do is, and the reason I introduce people is so that you could seek out any of us during the reception and learn a little bit about the risk community, how to get involved. And if you would like to do that electronically, it is www.sra for the Society for Risk Analysis.org/NCAC. That's the chapter name. Okay, that's my welcome from the chapter. And now what I'd like to do is start the program. Today we have 3 panelists. The program is approximately an hour and 20 minutes. We're going to start out with a presentation from Dr. Marchant, go into comments from Professor Dudley and Dr. Zalab. And what I can do now is maybe describe everyone's affiliation quickly, and then we'll start the program. And I think the acoustics are pretty good here in the room. Is that right? From the back, everybody can hear? So why don't we wait for questions until the very end, unless it's a question about clarification material. What we'll have is the presentation, the discussants, a little bit of a discussion amongst the panelists, and then we'll open it up for a Q&A. So if you've got clarifications, please let us know. Otherwise, we'll go right through the program and open it up at the very end. And at the end of the formal program, there's a reception. We're hoping you're going to stick around and meet each other and talk with the panelists. Gary Marchant is going to start the presentation. Dr. Marchant is the chair, the authors of the report. He is the Regents Professor of Law at the Sandra Day O'Connor School of Law at Arizona State in Tempe. Is it possible that Tempe is more pleasant today than it is here?
No, it's 116.
Okay. Just checking.
Cooling off here.
Dr. Marchant is going to explain the overall context for the report and its findings. The next speaker is Professor Dudley, who is, as she mentioned, the director of GW Regulatory Studies Program, formerly the head of OIRA in the Office of Management and Budget under President George W. Bush. Susan has recently returned from Dublin. Nicer weather, definitely, than we're having today. A little rain. A little rain. And I'm hoping that you can tell us about the meeting, as well as the context and what came out of it, in addition to the perception of the viability of precautionary principle. Great. And our last panelist is very dedicated to being here. He's not feeling perfectly well today. It's Dr. Ricardo Salvador. Did I pronounce your name correctly? Okay. Dr. Salvador is the Senior Scientist and Director of Food and Environmental Programs at the Union of Concerned Scientists. And key areas of focus, I believe, for your work are sustainable production and organic production of agriculture. The CAST report looks like this. It's on the website, and it's very easy to pull down. Maybe it's 10, 14 pages long. Is that about right? 20, okay, 20 pages, but it's well worth reading. It's very strongly worded. So Dr. Marchant and I spoke just briefly before the program started. In addition to putting this concept in context and looking at the various problems that we face in using it, next question would be, where do we go? What do we have today and where do we go? So I'm hoping the discussion will cover everything, a lot of what's in the report in terms of the findings about the precautionary principle, in addition to starting to lead us forward. With that, I'd like to ask Dr. Marchant to start the presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Sally and Susan, for hosting this, and thank Linda and Cass for giving us the opportunity to work on this. I'd never worked on any CAS project before, and got a call out of the blue and asked if I'd be interested in working on a project on the precautionary principle, and said sure, and got put together with 3 other experts, of which one, Linda Abbott's here today, and we were told just go forth, write whatever you want. It's just got to be evidence-based, based on research and literature, and come up with your opinion. And so we went forward and did that. These are our 4 committee members. We worked electronically and were able to put together the report. So if you ever get a cold call from Linda, it's a great opportunity to work on an interesting project. And then we shipped it out to some external reviewers who gave us very good feedback and comments for making the report stronger, in some cases stronger worded. So as you can tell, the topic is the precautionary principle, no role of precaution. One thing we do right up front is try and distinguish precaution, precautionary approach, and precautionary principle. That precaution is an essential part of our lives and of regulation. We all exercise precaution in our daily lives and lock our doors and look both ways before crossing the street. That's precaution. But we don't do too much precaution. We don't stay indoors and never leave. That wouldn't be healthy, actually. And so we try and find a reasonable balance of precaution. And similarly, in our regulatory system, we've always applied some degree of precaution. Nothing's known for sure ever in science. And so we're always applying some degree of precaution whenever we regulate. And the question is, how much precaution do we apply? And for many decades, we've debated that. People have different views on different specific regulatory issues. Are we being precautious enough or are too precautious? And people have been arguing about that for decades. But it was all done sort of implicitly. There was no express requirement of what precaution is supposed to apply, no guidelines or anything like that. And what the precautionary principle did, sort of this relatively new player in a game, it's sort of been around really in a major way for a couple decades now, is two things. One is it tried to make precaution more explicit, said this shouldn't be under the table or implicit, it should be an express requirement. And the second thing it did is to make it more stringent, to have a clear tilt towards more precaution being necessary. So those are sort of the two aspects of the precautionary principle that are different. And so we have this table in the thing of talking about precaution, that it should be something on everybody's agenda that we all apply, that every regulatory agency should apply. The precautionary approach is how the U.S. characterizes how the U.S. has applied precaution in our regulatory programs over the years. And then this new thing, the precautionary principle, which is different than the precautionary approach in that it's a legal requirement. So it's enforceable by courts. It's something that the agencies, say in the EU, that's adopted this as a legal instrument, is required by law to apply. And it gets enforced by the courts if they don't apply it right or they apply it not enough or too much. So that's the difference, is it's going from sort of just an implicit, sort of general philosophical sort of application to a legal rule, essentially. And the precautionary principle in the 2 decades or so since it's been around has been very prolific in terms of how it's spread around the world. Europe has been the clear leader in the precautionary principle, and they adopted it into the Treaty of Europe in 1992. And so that became a legally binding requirement at that point. It initially in the treaty says only for environmental applications, but the court and the EU Commission, the Council have now applied it to any health-based risk or risk context. So it's applied across the board in the EU as a legal requirement. It's now in something like 60 international treaties. A number of individual countries have adopted it into their national laws. For example, it's now in the French Constitution. Courts in some other countries, Canada will be on that list as well, Australia, India, have adopted it as a legal thing under the common law by the courts. And now it's popping up its head in the United States, mostly at city level, with a bunch of cities like San Francisco and Berkeley, Seattle, for example, adopting it also as a legal requirement. So it's spread fairly quickly. 1992 was this critical year because not only was that the year Europe adopted as a legal requirement, but it also was the year of the United Nations Special Session on the Environment, where the only version of the precautionary principle ever endorsed by the United States was adopted as well. So that was really the watershed year where the precautionary principle had been developing slowly in Sweden and Germany and other places, really came to the forefront, became a major policy innovation in the health and environmental risk area. And there's a number of justifications for the precautionary principle, some completely plausible and legitimate, going to less so. But one of the major drivers of this was a record and a very influential report in the EU of a number of examples where we had failed to apply sufficient precaution, and as a result, terrible things happened, and a lot of people died and got sick and so on. And examples you're very aware of are things like asbestos and CFCs, and a number of examples have been cited as past examples where we didn't apply precaution soon enough or rigidly enough. And that's one of the main drivers of the precautionary principle. In addition, a growing mistrust of government and industry has also fueled the precautionary principle. Things in Europe, like for example the mad cow disease, where the government assured people there was no risk of this passing to humans and were wrong, has also done this. The fact that we're developing a lot of new sort of, sometimes people use things like exotic technologies, things like biotechnology and nanotechnology and synthetic biology, create a lot of uncertainty, but a lot of sort of anxiety maybe by some people, and so that's again a major driver of applying the precautionary principle. The fact that a lot of our laws are outdated and haven't been updated for 30, 40 years, that we in many cases sort of treat the absence of evidence as evidence of absence of risk, which is not a truism, it's incorrect, and so that also fuels this. And then the increased role for non-governmental organizations, which weren't that prevalent 30, 40 years ago, are now much more part of the discussion, and they're often bringing things like the precautionary principle to the forefront. And then finally, from a less legitimate perspective, it can be used as a powerful protectionist trade tool. Countries for decades have tried to protect their own businesses and their own industries and products, and it's harder under the WTO rules, but this may provide a new tool for doing that, and we're going to see examples where it's used in that kind of way. So a number of factors driving this, and it's become a very prominent issue, and at this time it's sort of become an urgent or a good time to sort of revisit it. We now have 20 years of empirical record of how it's actually been applied in places like Europe to evaluate how it's done and where it's going. We have a lot of sort of new technologies, as I said, sort of on the forefront going forward, where the precautionary principle is standing as a major potential obstacle to these going forward at all. And so resolving how we should apply this principle will be key for these technologies' future and what future they have at all. We have a number of tensions and trade disputes going on with the precautionary principle, often in the agricultural area, of things like our genetically modified foods, of pesticide issues, of how we treat chickens, whatever, with Europe, with Russia, with Korea, China, and other countries right now. So it's a major obstacle to international trade, which should be a win-win situation. And then I think really timely is new negotiations about to begin between the EU and the United States on free trade negotiations, where this is going to clearly be a major difference between the two countries, or two jurisdictions, where Europeans are bringing the precautionary principle to the table and insisting it stay in effect, and we're saying, or hopefully we'll say, that this is actually a block to be able to have any kind of uniform standards in trade. So we're going to see this become a major obstacle in the next few months, and it'll be interesting to see how it's dealt with by both jurisdictions. And then we're also at a time where our need for better and more foods is going to get more and more intense. There's a lot of evidence of actually a lot of the productivity, at least the growth in it in agriculture, is declining in some places, actually going down in real terms. At the same time, there's other stresses on agriculture like climate change and other problems that are increasingly causing problems. And so now, one child starves to death every 10 seconds. As we're sitting here, every 10 seconds someone's dying from lack of food. We have enough food, we just don't know how to distribute it, but there's also ways we can also increase the availability of food, the durability of food, so it doesn't spoil and so on, using new technologies. But it's only going to get worse. The projections are by 2050 we have 9.1 billion, a 34% increase, and estimates by FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization, and others, we got to increase our food production by about 70% between now and 2050. And as most of our parameters of this are actually going down, how are we going to do that? How are we going to get this rapid increase when we're on a downward trajectory right now? And then you may have saw the new report just came out last week of the 2100 projection is actually much higher, going to 11 billion rather than it was 10.2 billion. Again, showing this sort of pressure to figure out how to get more productive food production and distribution and to prevent large starvation and malnutrition. So there's a lot of reasons why right now is a good time to evaluate the precautionary principle, and why when I got called by Cass, I was happy to get involved in this. And so what our committee did is sort of look at the precautionary principle. Well, what can we say about how it's actually worked so far now that we have 20 years of empirical evidence to look at it? And we sort of looked in two ways. We looked generally how it's applied, what sort of the trends and patterns, what evidence is there of that, and then focus in on 3 specific case studies. And our conclusion, as Sally referred to, was pretty strong. We were very negative in the end about the precautionary principle. Our bottom line is we need to get rid of the precautionary principle, and want to just summarize why we came to that conclusion. So first of all, looking at some of the generic problems with it. One is its ambiguity, that it's been adopted as a legal rule in many jurisdictions, but there's no definition of it. That's a problem when you are applying something legally and required to, and you don't know what it means. And so there's a lot of different definitions floating out there that we found in secondary sources that sometimes government agencies or courts would point to, but it was all different ones. And they had huge different implications. Here's 3 of the most common ones referred to. The first one is the only one the United States has ever endorsed, which is actually one it'd be hard for anyone to object to, just simply saying when there's serious threats of serious irreversible damage, the fact that you have some uncertainty shouldn't block regulation, doesn't require you to regulate, but saying it shouldn't block regulating. If you do regulate, it should be cost effective. And so that's actually a pretty modest version, one common sense one. That's not usually the one that's applied, though, by places that have adopted it. It's more like the wing spread definition, which was a definition put together by a number of proponents of the precautionary principle back in 1999. And this is much more stringent. It says when there's threats of harms to human health and environment, so it's any risk of all, and I've asked the writers of this, do they really mean any risk? And they said yes. That you should do things. It's not that you can, it's that you should. And there's no mention of things like cost effectiveness or anything in that, raising some questions about whether those apply or not. So that's a stricter version. And finally, there's one World Charter of Nature, which basically says unless you can prove absolute safety, you ban it, which would, if you applied it to any product, activity, or technology, would require a ban of it. So it would ban everything if we applied it to everything. So there's various different versions, and it would obviously make a huge difference which of these 3 or many others out there you're applying when you apply the precautionary principle. The second problem was that none of the versions we found answered some of the key questions you have to make about making a risk decision. So in deciding how to deal with a risk, you have to decide how substantial must the potential risk be before you'll reduce it. What level of risk is acceptable? 0 risk is not achievable, as we know, so you've got to come down to some level that you're going to accept. What early indications of potential hazard are sufficient to trigger a precautionary action? How much data must a proponent produce to demonstrate it's safe, given that there is no such thing as complete safety? How are costs and risk trade-offs factored in? And what action is required to satisfy the precautionary principle or whatever rule you apply is? And these questions are critical to any risk decision. None of the versions of the precautionary principle answer them. We have a lot of disputes about these questions. If we were to debate it among our society and our people involved in the regulatory world, people have different conclusions about this. And it'd be nice if we could just circumvent those whole debates by adopting some magical principle, the precautionary principle, which is what it tries to do, and not have to answer these questions. And I've been in a number of debates on the precautionary principle when I ask about these questions, and the answer I get is we can avoid having to address these. We can go around these questions. And we can't, is our conclusion. Yet you can't make sensible regulation without answering these questions. You can't avoid these hard questions, about which we don't agree, but we need to at least address. And when you are trying to avoid these and you have this ambiguous thing, you get decisions that are kind of out there and kind of indefensible. And so we found a number of these. Not every decision based on the precautionary principle is unreasonable. Most are probably actually reasonable, but most could probably be made without the precautionary principle. A similar decision would likely have been made. But some of the ones that are specifically attributed to the precautionary principle was Norway's action to ban cornflakes that were fortified with 19 essential vitamins, and the argument was that this fortification could potentially harm somebody. It had the effect of banning the US product, Kellogg's, while allowing the domestic product to go forward. And this was stricken down by a European court as lacking any scientific justification whatsoever, a completely protectionist trade measure that was justified solely based on the precautionary principle was the reason the government of Norway gave for this action. Similarly, France banned caffeinated energy drinks based on the conclusion that the precautionary principle justifies this because otherwise pregnant women might drink these drinks. It didn't ban coffee, it didn't ban wine that happened to be made in France, and so it was a very paternalistic but also protectionist decision that again was stricken down by the EU courts as lacking any scientific plausibility whatsoever, but based solely on the precautionary principle. The third example of the same type of protectionist action was Denmark banning ocean spray cranberry drinks because the vitamin C in that could potentially harm someone, which I guess is plausible, but vitamin C tends to be probably good for you rather than harm on overall. And again, this ended up getting stricken down as lacking any justification. So in some cases, the European courts have been strict in enforcing this, in others they haven't. But these are ones that were all stricken down, but were adopted based, the justification given by the government is the precautionary principle. Another example that didn't have such a good outcome was in Zambia, where the precautionary principle was invoked by the very well-fed 300-pound president of Zambia to say that his country did not want U.S. food aid, even though millions of people were starving. And in fact, had people with machine guns stop people from rioting and getting the food they're trying to get. That was grain that had been corn from the United States that we all eat. But the concern was that because there could be some low-level genetically modified kernels in there, it's better for people to starve based on the precautionary principle again, rather than eating this food. And then the last example is the EU justified state subsidization of coal production. And the reason they gave was the precautionary principle, without explaining at all how the precautionary principle justifies coal mining, even though many people think that might be one of the least sustainable forms of energy. It was invoked to sort of this magic wand that sort of justify whatever you want to subsidize coal production in Europe. So it's been used for a lot of different things. Again, each time it's invoked, it doesn't give any rationale. Why does the precautionary principle justify this action that in some cases seems kind of counterintuitive? And the thing about the application of the precautionary principle is there never had to be an explanation. You simply wave the wand and the action follows. The third problem, and probably the one we concluded was the most important, is it didn't really address the full consideration of risks and benefits of technologies. Almost everything that we're going to have in our society that we're going to regulate is there for a reason. It has a benefit as well as a risk. And the question in making a reasonable decision is to figure out what is a reasonable balance of that. And what we find is that the precautionary principle is repeatedly applied to look only at the risk side or the uncertainty side with no weight whatsoever given to the benefits. And so when you look at some of these new technologies like biotechnology or nanotechnology, there's tremendous potential upsides for public health, for environment, and other social benefits are not giving any weight at all in the application of the precautionary principle to them, whereas the uncertainty and the risks are. And there's no comparative risk of looking at other technologies about the relative risk and uncertainty about them. Another interesting thing we found is that some literature finding that when governments applied the precautionary principle, one justification potentially for applying it is to try and reassure your public that the issues being, or the technologies being looked at and governed. We found that the studies find that people's anxiety about that technology goes up rather than down when you apply the precautionary principle. It's like a red flag. You're sort of labeling something as something to be concerned about. So this is a cartoon. Cass Sunstein, who is President Obama's head of OIRA, has written about this. The precautionary principle, for all its rhetorical appeal, is deeply incoherent. It is, of course, true that we should take precautions against some speculative dangers, but there is always risk on both sides of a decision. Inaction can bring danger, but so can action. Precautions, in other words, themselves create risk, and hence the principle bans what it simultaneously requires. In this cartoon of, you can go out on the beach, and if you're only looking at the risks, it makes sense to wear armor out on the beach, and you'll get no sunburn and no skin cancer. But if you're looking at the benefits or the other side of this, it makes no sense at all to wear that. And so the problem with the precautionary principle is only looking at sort of one side of the equation, and that can skew decision making. So that was sort of our generic overview of the precautionary principle, finding these three major problems. And then we did more in-depth case studies on three specific agricultural or food-related technologies of agricultural chemicals or pesticides, genetically modified foods, and food irradiation. And again found, whether expressly articulated as a precautionary principle or more of a precautionary approach, we found problems in how this is applied. But again, the general conclusion being not a balancing of the overall costs and benefits or risks and benefits of these different technologies. And so in the case of pesticides, the United States, although it doesn't invoke the precautionary principle in name, does still apply a precautionary approach, particularly after the Food Quality Protection Amendments in 1996. And in that, it's taken away any consideration of the benefits of the agricultural chemical, which we used to consider but don't anymore. And so we get examples used in our discussed in our reports, such as sulfur fluoride, where EPA is in the process of banning it based on sort of a cumulative risk assessment, where this particular chemical only provides a very, very small percentage of the risk or the exposure from fluoride, and yet has important benefits that would probably be, and would be replaced by probably a more harmful pesticide. But none of that can be considered in the regulatory decision, resulting in decisions that don't seem to make sense. Similarly on GM foods, that the precautionary principle has been used in Europe particularly to severely, essentially almost de facto ban it in the European Union. And now in countries like India and Philippines are also invoking the precautionary principle to block this technology, even though every major scientific organization that's looked at this has concluded there's no greater risk from GM foods than conventional foods, including the European Union's own scientific advisors, which have concluded that this is as safe, if not safer, than conventional foods, after looking at over 500 studies twice. And so, despite the fact that there's no greater risk from these technologies, are being impeded and prohibited based on the precautionary principle as a justification for this. And these are having a lot of detrimental impacts, not only in blocking that technology, blocking innovation, but also in disrupting international trade. It's become a huge problem of these billion-dollar disasters every time a stray corn or wheat seed is found that is clearly of no health or environmental risk, and yet is being resulting in many cases $1 billion or more of economic damages, and more tragically of technologies such as golden rice and improved cassava for the developing world being impeded. Just last week, the Environmental Secretary of Great Britain gave a speech in which he claimed that something like 7 million children have died from our delay in implementing golden rice, and that this can't continue any longer. It's unethical to do so. And then finally, our third example is food irradiation, which is, again, every scientific organization that's looked at this has found it to be safe and beneficial, and yet it's being impeded and it's being used much less than it probably should to make our food safer, to save people's lives and save them from getting sick. And yet, because of these precautionary concerns in the United States and in Europe, this technology is not being implemented to the extent it should. And again, no weighing of the risks of using the technology against the risks of not using it. So all three case studies, again, we sort of found the same trend of sort of this one side focus on only the risk or uncertainty, no consideration given to the health, environmental, and other benefits, is skewing our decision making to get decisions that we don't think can be justified based on the evidence. And so our overall conclusion is that precautionary principle may well be the most innovative, pervasive, and significant new concept in environmental policy over the past quarter century. It may also be the most reckless, arbitrary, and ill-advised. So that's our strong wording that we put in there. And that was deliberate, because that was our conclusion after looking at the evidence. And so we basically concluded that it is a flawed and a failed concept. The question is, can it be fixed? Can we give it more criteria? Can we make it more reasonable? And our conclusion after 20 years is no, it can't. It seemed for a while it might have been able to. The European Union in 2000 put out a 29-page communication to try and articulate some standards, one of which is you must look at the costs and benefits expressly. And that communication was so attacked within the European Union by the Parliament, by various organizations that have standing, the way the EU works with all these different committees, by the NGOs, that the European Union gave up on trying to articulate what the precautionary principle means and decided they can't agree on what it means. And so they're just going to continue to apply it when they don't know what it means. And so after 20 years, many people have tried, many academics have written how the precautionary principle could work in practice, and it's never actually applied that way in the real world. And so our conclusion is it can't be fixed, it's broken. It's based on a flawed assumption that you only look at part of the question, not all of it, and that that's not reasonable decision making, and that it's only going to make things worse. And our experience from personal contacts and others is that many people in the European Union are now coming to that same conclusion but can't figure out how to get out of the mess they're in, and that they've made a mistake going down that road. So our conclusion is precaution is important. Addressing Sally's question, we have to think of ways to make the application of precaution more principled, that there needs to be precaution or regulatory decision. The precautionary principle, though, does not provide the answer of how to do that. It's a failed policy that we use our Goldilocks analogy. We don't want too little precaution. We don't want too much. We want just right. How do we do that? We don't have the answer to that, but that'd be a great topic for discussion, because that's, I think, where we need to go to. And just a couple concluding slides. There's always an easy solution to every human problem, neat, plausible, and wrong. That's how we describe the precautionary principle. And our final cartoon, something's just not right. Our air is clean, our water is pure, we all get plenty of exercise, everything we eat is organic and free range, and yet nobody lives past 30. That's our summary in a nutshell. As was mentioned, you can download this report for free from the website, and I look forward to our comments and then discussion.
Thank you. That's your third presentation today?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's very much.
I don't know if it gets better or worse each time.
Any clarifying questions for Dr. Rashan before we move on? Tim?
Just want to be absolutely clear, in your case study from Zambia, I'm not intimately familiar with the situation in Zambia. However, the situation next door in Malawi was very specific. It had to do with exporting corn products to Europe. And the feeling on the part of the Malawian government that they couldn't afford to do that because their exports would stop. Was that the rationale in Zambia, or was it truly a question of supplying food to the population?
Well, so that's a good point. There's a number of African countries at that point, and their concern, which I think was a concern in Zambia, is that if you're growing GM crops, or if people could take those corn and plant them, that could impede your exports to Europe, which does not accept those GM crops.
Not
And that
stop cold in its tracks.
stop cold in its tracks, which could have a huge devastating thing. In response to that concern, the U.S. offered to mill all the food aid. And they did that for Zimbabwe and 4 other countries who then accepted the U.S. corn. Zambia, even with a mill, which can't be replanted, refused still to accept it. So they were sort of farther than the other countries.
Are there any other?
Clarify for us, you started by saying that the precautionary principle is a legal requirement, and then gave some examples. I'm not familiar with all of the case studies that you mentioned, but they seem to be focused as much on the precautionary approach, and what I believe you think is a misuse of the approach, but not focusing on the notion of precautionary principle as a legal requirement. And going forward, I'm interested in how you want us to understand the report, considering that I think there seems to have been a shift in how you were arguing.
Right, so that's a good point. And we were looking at both, and maybe in my 20 minutes I couldn't make that as clear, but we've looking at now over 100 court decisions in the European Union that have expressly applied the precautionary principle. And I've actually written a whole book on that topic, showing how it's being applied in a very arbitrary, inconsistent manner. In some cases, the EU is saying, the courts of the EU is saying the precautionary principle adds nothing new. It's completely irrelevant. And other times it says it overrides every fundamental legal concept we have in the European Union, and everywhere in between. So it's applied in a completely arbitrary, and that's the name of my book, arbitrary and capricious manner as a legal requirement in the EU. what we wanted to do is go further, though, and also look at just sort of applying precaution generally, that there's problems with precaution if you don't have some kind of criteria for applying it. And so that's one of the challenges is to, if we throw out the precautionary principle, which we've never adopted as a legal requirement in the United States, there's still this problem of what is the right amount of precaution, how do you apply it, how do you do that balancing process? So that helps make it clearer, sorry.
Okay, we're going to start the panel. Would you like to join us up front?
I don't have any slides, Ricardo.
And we're going to start with Professor Duncan.
Is this on? Well, thank you, Gary, thank you for the paper. I enjoyed it, and Linda and the other authors. I enjoyed reading the paper. And I agree with Sally, it's very clearly written, and I think it nicely presents the history of the precautionary principle, how it's used, and some of the issues involved in it, especially as it applies to food questions. And I generally agree with the paper, and so I'm very glad that Ricardo got his voice back so that there'll be some disagreement on our panel today. I also want to point out that it's, as Sally mentioned, you said that other of CAST papers are well documented and well done. It's true, there's a very nice literature review, not literature review, but in the back there's all the sources that are used. So I think it's useful for people who are interested in this. So Gary made several points that I'm not going to remake about the long-standing criticism of the principle and in its ambiguity. And the paper, I think, nicely goes through different levels of that ambiguity and different problems. You know, that there's no agreed upon definition or criteria, that if taken literally, it's internally inconsistent because it violates its own standard of better safe than sorry, if you interpret it literally. And that it tends to get applied arbitrarily, used to protect incumbents or domestic producers or to block new technologies. So last week, I mean, this is actually timely for me because I just got back from Dublin where the European Risk Summit was held a week and a half ago. So I told people I was in Ireland for a summit and they all thought I was at the G8, but no, it was a much smaller summit, Global Risk Summit, but very important nevertheless. They brought together international policy officials, is it not? International policy officials, academics, NGOs, and industry scientists to discuss how to advance the use of evidence and risk-based rulemaking in Europe. Oh, that sounds better. Is that everybody can hear me better now? And the ambiguity in the definition and application of the principle was evident from that discussion. As Gary noted and as the paper notes, Europe has adopted a precautionary principle, whereas in the U.S. we often use a precautionary approach. So it's implicit in some of our statutes. So as a result of that, the Europeans talk about precautionary principle a lot more than we do. So one of the elected officials at the meeting spoke about the importance of basing regulatory decisions on the precautionary principle, sound science, and rigorous benefit-cost analysis. Now, each of those things is attractive and appealing to voters, and yet, what do they mean in practice, and how do you combine them? Several of the speakers were critical of the precautionary principle for a lot of the reasons that Gary talked about today, the vague definition, the incompatibility with other EU policy objectives, how it's often arbitrarily applied to political ends, and that it actually prevents good health-enhancing decisions. Now, one interesting point, at least for me, was that even those who supported the precautionary principle argued that it should be part of the risk management decision and not part of how we assess risks. And the importance of distinguishing the science, of doing objective science that objectively helps us understand the potential risks, and without relying on assumptions, precautionary assumptions that embed that in the risk assessment and in the estimates. So one thing I find interesting, and I think the paper actually mentions it, is despite the European endorsement of the precautionary principle, there's an evidence that the U.S. often takes a more precautionary approach, erring, and when I say that I mean erring on the side of overstating risks in setting health-based standards. And George Gray, who you've all heard mentioned today because he had hoped to be here and sends his apologies. He's a professor in the School of Public Health here. His paper, that's one of the ones mentioned in the bibliography, of 2004, compares World Health Organization standards with U.S. standards for acceptable daily intakes and reference doses. And he finds that often the U.S. standards are more stringent than the World Health Organization standards. And the reason for that is that in the U.S. we often embed those precautionary assumptions in the assessment of the risk itself. Now, one of the speakers at the conference last week, who is from an NGO and is a supporter of the precautionary principle, he very eloquently said we really shouldn't do that. He said, look, scientists have value judgments and policy opinions too, and he encouraged policymakers to try to distinguish the science from the policy when making decisions, and he warned them not to use science as an excuse for taking action or not taking action. That's something that I think is very important. It's something that the Regulatory Studies Center has focused some of our research on, and I think is worth discussing some more perhaps. Now, Sally and Gary set me up unintentionally, I think, saying that, well, if we ditch the precautionary principle, then what do we do? So I thought a little bit about what our objectives should be for a guiding principle for making policy judgments when in the face of uncertainty. So I have four kind of criteria. One is that we should avoid both type 1 and type 2 errors. And I always get mixed up what's type 1 and type 2. But one type is where you take an action that turns out to have some bad consequences that you didn't anticipate. And that, as Gary mentioned, is what the precautionary principle focuses on exclusively, avoiding that type of error. But there's also another type of error that if you don't act, you lose the benefit of something that you would have gotten from that action. That's also an error. And that's something that, a principle that maybe it's the Goldilocks strategy that Gary talks about, or we might call it the optimizing principle, might address both of those and try to weigh them. So I would say in the U.S., we try to adopt an optimizing principle or a Goldilocks principle. Every president has adopted requirements for regulatory impact analysis requirements that try to balance the risks and understand both the benefits and the costs. Although, as Gary mentioned, we do have several statutes that do focus more on that first type of error. So that's one of my principles, avoid both types of errors. The other is that I think a strategy or principle should encourage transparency about the uncertainty in the science that informs the decision. So it gets back to what the NGO at the EU Risk Summit was saying. We need to distinguish the positive scientific analysis from the normative policy judgments, and don't disguise your policy judgments as if they're science. A third objective for a principle should be that it provides incentives for learning and reducing uncertainty. So, and recognizes that knowledge is generated from a lot of different sources. So what can we do to do that? And then finally, that it recognizes diversity among people in our values and our preferences. So those are my four criteria. I'm going to use an illustration that the same supporter of the precautionary principle at the EU Summit used. He said, if you, to support the precautionary principle, he said, imagine you're taking a walk in the woods and you come across a mushroom that you've never seen before. Do you eat it? No, you don't. You walk away. So you avoid that, and that's his explanation for the precautionary principle. Now that's very intuitively appealing, I think, to most of us, but does it accurately describe your decision-making framework in that situation, and is it generalizable to other situations? I think the optimizing principle might lead you to the very same conclusion, so that you don't want to eat it. You look at this mushroom you don't know, the nutrition content of mushrooms generally is pretty darn low. It could be bad when we know mushrooms are toxic, and hey, you can go home and buy some from the Giants. So maybe you still walk away. But maybe you don't. Maybe you really like foraging for your food instead of buying stuff in a cello-wrapped package. So maybe instead you want to gather a little more information. So you take it home, you might do a spore sample, and you look at your mushroom guidebook and figure out, and sure enough, maybe it's a morel. And that would be really awesome. And so you might actually come to a very different conclusion with a little more information. And then I'm going to expand the scenario a little further. What if you're walking in the woods and you're actually lost in the wilderness and you don't know when you're going to be rescued, and you come across, maybe not a mushroom because we've already established they don't have much nutritional content, but you come across a fruit, a tree with some fruit on it. The precautionary principle would say, don't eat it. You don't know what it is, it might make you sick, don't eat it. But you're running out of food, you don't know when you'll be found. Not eating that fruit, taking that risk, may mean the difference between life and death. And I think a Goldilocks principle, or this optimizing principle, would allow you to weigh those different risks. So I think it's more generalizable and more likely to avoid the two types of errors, both the unintended harm from the action, but also the foregone benefits of not acting. And it also encourages learning to try to reduce the uncertainty, reduce those errors and reduce the uncertainty. So does that mean that there's no role for precaution? It's not clear to me there's absolutely no role. I was actually at a Crop Life conference last week, and several of the Crop Life folks are here, where people talked about it. A precautionary approach is really like doing a worst case. It's your worst case scenario. And if you do a worst case scenario as a screen, and you find that something looks safe and worth doing, you don't need to go to further steps. You don't need to do an elaborate weighing of all the different things. But if your decision, if it fails that precautionary screen, the optimizing principle wouldn't stop there, but it would take you to the next step and ask additional questions. How plausible is that worst case scenario? Is the decision to act reversible, or the decision not to act reversible? What is the probable outcome versus the possible outcome? And that requires some understanding of uncertainty and a recognition that there are a range of risks on both sides of the equation. And then I'm sure I'm running out of time, so my final note, I don't think it's discussed in the paper, but it relates to that fourth objective that I had for the guiding, for what we want in a guiding principle. So implicit in the precautionary principle is that the decision must be made collectively. So should irradiated beef or GMO foods be allowed to be sold? Another EU policy official at the event talked about what she had called the Baumgartner principle, after Felix Baumgartner, who jumped from the sky without a parachute. Maybe he did it. Anyway, clearly he was not following the precautionary principle. She said most of us would not take that risk, but in her view, that was his decision to make. So I guess we could have that, what was his name, Nick Valendra yesterday did something else that I think none of us would do. So the optimizing principle should make that, it should distinguish between decisions that have to be made collectively because they affect everybody. You know, one person can't make a choice without it affecting others, and those where individuals should be free to decide for themselves. So I would argue in concluding that things like irradiated beef and GMO foods actually fall in that latter category.
Okay, excellent. Very interesting, very thoughtful. Okay, Gordon.
Thank you. So you'll see that Susan preempted most of what I had to say to you here, but I'll go ahead at any rate because I think I can provide some information closer to the ground in terms of how these concepts actually make a difference, particularly in the service of what the title of this report makes an appeal to, which is feeding current and future generations. So the folks that have spoken already, of course, are the experts in terms of the regulatory aspects of this argument. But we are given to understand that the reason why it's important to resolve this is because the future of the planet's population is at stake, particularly our nourishment. So I want to address that. One of the things that I particularly liked about the paper, and I agree with the assessment that it's a very truly written paper that lays out its principles and its logic very well, so it's easy to follow, is that in a number of places it actually makes an appeal to systemic thinking. There is the notion that when you perturb a sufficiently complex system, that there are ripple effects that must be followed through, and one should not fix just on the factor of the system that has been perturbed. And so I would like to elaborate on that here. At one point, I'll quote this paper 2 or 3 times here, and this is the first time. At one point, the paper states, It is in the joint interests of government, industry, NGOs, and the general public to ensure appropriate risk management is applied with all technologies to minimize unreasonable risks and injury. So I want to point out a few things about this paragraph, which is, I think, very deep. So first of all, I don't think we should dissemble about the broad dynamic which is at play when we discuss these regulatory issues. By which I mean we are talking about ways in which we actually effectuate or act upon political economy. Who invests, who pays, who wins when it comes to technologies. Secondly, that particular argument was predicated particularly on technologies. I'll follow through with another couple of statements that focus the argument around the precautionary principle on whether we should roll out specific technologies or not. And of course, that has been focused in the real world. But the primary reason why I'm citing that particular passage to you is that it very appropriately lists the players in the play. And so we have here industry, NGOs, the general public. There is a very appropriate role for each one of these players in the argument that we are examining here. There's another point in this paper that I'll cite to you that says, nevertheless, because non-governmental advocacy organizations have gained voice and have proven to wield significant influence on governmental policy, I won't finish that quotation. That was the part that attracted me the most. Most of the time we don't feel that effective, and so it's quite flattering to read that someone does have that assessment of the role that we play. But I go back to the passage around technology, and this is, I think, the crux of what Susan and Gary have talked about. Here is this passage. Because there are risks from using the technology and also risks from not using it, this has been mentioned several different times, precaution cannot be increased on one side of the question without increasing itself on the other. So this concept of balancing the risks on either side is the critical thing that we're trying to understand. And of course, depending on which perspective we take here, the interest of rolling out a technology and the interest of being cautious about the effects of that technology, we will claim that the other side is not sufficiently balanced. And so I think we need to be clear that that's part of what the dynamic is here, and now I would like to flesh that out specifically around this question of whether it is really the case that unless we sort ourselves out on the precautionary principle and allow potentially beneficial technologies to roll out, we may face impending doom in terms of not being able to nurture the planet. So the way that I would like to do that is to talk about actual data. In another part of this report, the paper very appropriately points out that we now have a track record with many of these technologies that we can go to and simply observe what has happened in the real world. Of all the technologies that have been cited here, irradiation, synthetic biology, GMOs, I think GMOs are probably the leading one that most people would be familiar with and that have and has risen to the greatest level of concern. So I want to address that one first of all. I also want to cite a paper to talk about this, and so here are our data. This is a recent paper just in published just in the last couple of months by Hilbrook and colleagues. I want to focus on their finding and basically just set up the context for you. There are countries in Europe which have never accepted the production of GMO, particularly corn, that we can compare with other countries within Europe that actually have accepted the production of GMO corn. And of course, we can always compare with what the United States has done, which has accepted the production of GMO crops of all types. And in this particular study, the comparison is over the period of time when GMOs have been available, comparing the production levels. Now, I go to this very specific measure because of the fact that an imputed argument is that unless we can actually produce more food, then we are dooming the future to hunger. Now, I would like to point out that over the entire industrial period of agriculture, we have produced more food than is necessary to feed the people living on the planet, including right now. And yet, we don't feed everyone. And of course, the facile response to that is always that it's a distribution issue. I want to address that because that trivializes the issue too much. But the point is that when we make arguments that technologies that could increase production that they are imperatives because of the fact that we must have more production in order to have a chance to feed everyone, has this difficulty that historically, what we can say, what we can observe, is that in itself is not sufficient in order to be able to feed the world. we must, first of all, solve the obstacle to actually distributing that food appropriately before we can really reasonably claim that it's the volume of production that is a limitant, and therefore we need technologies to address that, while not addressing the systemic issues, which is what I began speaking about. So I promised you that I wanted to flesh this out. When you compare yields of corn in Europe in countries that have never accepted GMO versus countries that have, say Spain, and the three comparisons here of those countries that did not, are the Germanic countries, Switzerland, Austria, and Germany. There is no difference in their yield. Likewise, in the United States, the difference when you compare the yield between those three countries to the yield levels in the United States, average yield levels around 10 tons per hectare, there is no statistical difference. So that after a little bit more than a decade of rolling out these technologies, if we were to claim, or if we have an interest, that GMO technologies in and of themselves are critical in order to be able to raise production, there is no data that actually supports that view. Now, another point that I'd like to make about this is that the authors further pursued the argument that unless we allow the development of these new technologies, farmers will have lesser and lesser choice when it comes to the cultivars that they are able to use. Whereas in fact there is a monopoly effect because GMOs are very expensive to develop. Now if you think about this a little bit, we're at the very beginning of an era where we're beginning to understand how the genome operates, how it's regulated, how we can manipulate it. At the moment, we have the capacity to insert single genes, perhaps stack 2 or 3 of them. This is a major accomplishment at the moment to get them to express in a coordinated fashion. This comes at cost. There's yield drag when this occurs. It's part of the explanation of some of the data that I just described. But the key thing about that is that this very expensive proposition needs to be mounted on a platform that gives it a chance to succeed. Namely, those 3 genes are mounted on a platform of 30,000, 40,000 other genes, which we breed through conventional breeding. So that the majority of yield increases we have documented, and others have as well, over the period when GMOs have been implemented are due to the traditional breeding more than to the GMO additions. In very few cases have those actually added to yield. In the best of cases, what you can say, particularly in the case of insect control, is that they have stabilized yield at the particular level that the traditional breeding enables. So that's an important point to consider. But for me, what is more important is that these are technologies. Now, remember the point that I made earlier, that these arguments are made in favor of rolling out a particular technology, and therefore we have an issue where parties that have an interest in rolling out technologies are arguing for this point. Let's talk about the issue of hunger on the ground. Hungry people are materially, in most cases, poor, and in most cases, capital poor. In economic terms, they don't have access to the factors of production. Land, labor, rent, and economists would say in some cases the opportunity to express their entrepreneurialism. That is a complex topic on its own, and I won't elaborate on that right here, but if that is the limitation, then the way that you deal with it is to work on factors that deal with access to sovereignty over land, labor, rent, livable wages. In the United States, there was a massive public investment that they developed under the knowledge that now we see as modern industrial agriculture, coupled together with policies to roll out that information to farmers, to support farmers through incentives and prices, to support farmers by indemnifying for almost every possible loss, including market failures. Typical issue, too, to understand is that something that is not in common in many developing economies, particularly among the poor, and the majority of them are farmers of limited means, is that the agricultural system that we're familiar with depends most of all on economy of scale. It is an extremely expensive system, and it's distributed among 310 million of us. That's how we can afford to develop the knowledge, and that's how we can afford to pay for it. Both of these are very expensive undertakings. So that, by definition, one cannot take those very expensive technologies to farmers of limited means and expect that there's going to be viability in rolling those out to them. Instead, we incur debt, we incur further deepening the problems that they have in terms of having limited access to resources. So I don't want to go more deeply into that, but let me address that. What I'm trying to embody here is the full balance of the risks and benefits of just this particular technology. I think I've dealt with the yield issue, which is supposed to be the benefit. But this is not to raise the issues that are actually not taken into account in terms of the damage when rolling out this particular technology. And so, for instance, not taken into account typically in analyses like the ones that are cited in this paper are the fact that on the basis of the ultimate objective on which they were purportedly rolled out, which is basically that they would give us a greener agriculture, make us less reliant on chemicals that would pollute the environment and have other toxic effects. Contrary-wise, we actually have an epidemic. It is a crisis in farmland right now of uncontrollable superweeds, which now are leading to greater application of herbicides than existed prior to the rollout of these technologies. Not taking into account the opportunity cost of not developing traditional breeding because we're investing now in GMOs, and we could continue talking about other aspects on the negative side of the ledger. So there's the monopoly effect, there's the bias effect, there's the fact that there's not greater productivity, there's the fact that this is not going to address the problems of the poor and the hungry. So this is the primary question that I have, and on the precautionary principle itself, let me just say that it seems to me, this is not my expertise, it seems to me like some of the examples in the paper and some of those that we've heard here have actually given me reason to, first of all, learn. I've been educated about the fact that there are aspects of this principle that need to be perfected, that need to be improved. But it seems to me like if the central argument is that when confronted with technologies and potential effects both on human health and the environment that we've never seen before, to the extent that we don't have the science to even know what questions to ask, it is prudent, as in the example of the Morel, to actually allow an adequate period of time for us to develop the knowledge to be able to make the appropriate decision, which I understand is part of the principle, not that we can just arbitrarily halt supposed progress, but actually allow the time and the science and the knowledge and the regulatory systems to be put into place so that then wise decisions can be made on behalf of the public interest. So I would like to emphasize that and possibly end on that point, because it is on behalf of the public interest that I think we need to remind ourselves that the rollout of technologies like this needs to be balanced, because it seems to me that the argument that I hear primarily is for the rollout of technologies that will increase private profit. And so we need to balance that against what the actual impact will be in the actual public interest, not the reified, putative public interest that we see in the title of the report. Thank you.
Thanks very much. That was, again, really thoughtful, great comments. Okay, I have two issues that I just wanted to mention. One is, how do we build consensus for collective decision-making in the regulatory enterprise? How do we build trust as we're strengthening the regulatory enterprise? Strengthening doesn't mean that we make it more strict. Strengthening means that it's an effective type of effort by the government. So I'm just wondering, those two issues hadn't quite been brought up, but a wide range of issues have. Would you like to address the issues?
Well, I could give you those quick answers, but we should probably get to the discussion. But those are big, huge questions. I have a lot of comments on a lot of this, but maybe we should turn it to the audience, and maybe I can bring in some of the answers if we respond to the question.
Okay, so these are, tell me again, I'm sorry.
Well, so, I mean, both consensus and trust are huge issues.
Right.
There is, I mean, one of Susan's important points is there is diversity. I mean, another area I'm doing research in right now is process methods. It's just very clear that people are different in their priorities and in how they want to accept risks and so on. We are different in that. And so the question is, from a social consensus, how do we make those decision-making? And so Susan's point of trying to the extent you can, tailor individual choice makes a lot of sense, because there is these fundamental differences. And if we make a societal decision, say this is the answer, some people are not going to be happy with that. So to the extent we can minimize that by allowing individual choice, that's great. But if my choice hurts you, then that doesn't necessarily work. So there's some that won't work that way. In terms of trust, I think again, there's this very interesting work being done on new models of governance that include NGOs, industry, rather than just sort of government telling industry what to do, but sort of more collaborative models that I think are adaptive. Another point that Susan made is that we got to sort of learn as we go along, and there's a tremendous amount of literature and interesting work being done in that area. But again, a huge challenge for trust.
What about in terms of the issues raised by Ricardo?
Well, so I thought excellent comments. I disagree with a lot of it. I mean, so, you say there's no evidence of increased yield. There's a great article in this month's PLSO1 looking empirically in India over a lengthy 15-year period and finding, the adoption of the BT cotton going up dramatically, the yield going up dramatically, the income to those families going up dramatically, all these benefits and their nutrition going up dramatically. So there is a lot of empirical evidence showing a very strong benefit. There's studies in China showing clear reductions in pesticide deaths and poisoning of real lives being saved with this. There's studies have done by other people than the ones you cited in the United States and elsewhere. There's a very good article in this month's Trends in Plant Science that's saying the exact opposite about Europe, that in fact European agriculture is on the clear decline because of the lack of adoption of GM foods, and they need to change it by a lot of leading scientists who are not industry people. So there's a lot of different empirical data on this. The one thing I agree with you on is that's the level we need to look at this. We need to look at the evidence. We need to get as much evidence on the table as we can and make informed evidence-based decisions. We can't just apply a principle and say, you know, that's the answer automatically. It comes down to the facts, and what we need is more of it, and to you know, compare these studies that are saying different things. What's the basis for that difference? Can we understand that and try to come to some consensus on what the facts can tell us and what they can't?
Ricardo, would you like to?
Well, just very brief. I think on the conclusion we're in agreement, and although this is not the place to get too much into it, I'll just address the disparity in the reports that you cite. It is very important when looking at those papers how they actually derive those insights, as you said, and that you will get different outcomes when you actually do survey-based reports where the farmers give you testimonials about what they're doing and what their experiences are, as opposed to when you do the objective measurement of yields, the prices, and the incomes.
The PLS one is the latter. It's actual empirical data. And just one other point I wanted to say is just to make clear that I'm not saying that these technologies are the be-all and end-all, and they don't, and that we don't need to do the other type of issues you raise. I'm saying we need to apply everything we have. That's what the National Academy of Sciences and others have said as well. I don't want to take anything off the table. I think these are huge problems, and certainly the type of issues you're talking about may be as important, if not more important, as strategies. But I don't want to take anything out of that set of tools we have to deal with these problems.
I guess the one thing that I'll respond to there, and then you know, so that we don't turn it into a discussion among panelists here, is on your last point, that I think that is very important, that you're acknowledging that for farmers of limited resources, there may be other more appropriate methods initially, which basically responds to doing what you can with what people have on hand. Although it would be a rich discussion whether even among farmers of means and industrial economies, this is really the best way of implementing agriculture. This is not the place to get into that.
Okay, we're going to open it up. We have a microphone in the center. I think we're going to try and turn these off unless we need them. Don't worry about this.
I don't think they turn off.
Okay, so what we'd like is a lively debate, discussion, so please join the discussion and come use the microphone.
Thank you. My name's Claire Thorpe and I'm from Crop Life America. As you can tell from my accent, I'm also not American, and I spent a long time working in European agriculture. And I'd like to address the comments that were made by Dr. Ricardo and Dr. Marchand about the differences in yields and farmers and the impact of technology. We've spoken a lot about the consumers and the benefits and risks to consumers and the various stakeholders, be it government or industry, but we also need to reflect on the people who actually use these technologies, and that is the farmers. And farmers may produce the same crops, but they produce them in a very great variety of different growing conditions. And so what's very important for farmers, and which people don't seem to factor into this, is their need for tools in the toolbox, so to speak, and the assumption that they are businessmen and they're also scientists, and so they know how to make choices which are most appropriate. So to get back to the question of yield, the use of these technologies is not just down to yield, it's down to having appropriate technologies available for the circumstances under which you farm. So yes, in certain circumstances this technology might not be appropriate, but in other scenarios it is eminently appropriate. And one of the reasons you might not see such a great difference in yields between the US and the EU is because in order to achieve the yields that are achieved in the EU, their other inputs are significantly higher. So for example, pesticide use could be higher. The need to cultivate the ground frequently, which incurs costs in fuel, are also higher. So when you're a farmer, what you're looking at is not just your yield, but how much money you make on that yield relative to the inputs that you have to put in. And one of the benefits of these technologies, such as genetically modified organisms, as they call them, is that the need for these inputs actually declines. And one of the benefits is actually environmental, as well as being to the margin of the farmer. But to get back to the precautionary principle and how it operates, again, what technologies do we make available? We're not trying to force technologies on farmers. There is a degree of choice that obviously they need to make. But when you engage in a precautionary principle approach, you don't make technologies available. Historically, what ends up happening is that you ban them. And once you ban something, it's very hard then to make a step-by-step science-based decision process to actually reintroduce anything, precisely because you've created fear around that product, and then you've created an environment where people don't want to go back and revisit it and see whether or not the science has developed and told them something new. And in banning it, you also prevent that science from taking place. So there's twofold there. Thank you.
Well, that was a comment more than a question. So
Yes,
that was a comment.
to the panel if they can respond.
Okay, why don't we get a few questions coming up and then respond, please.
I'm Greg Konka with the Competitive Enterprise Institute here in Washington. And one of the things that I appreciated about the paper is your discussion of the tremendous arbitrariness of the application of the precautionary principle in practical settings. And one of the things that I would like to probe Ricardo Salvador on is his opposition to so-called GMOs in the absence of any sort of context on how crop modification has been taking place, particularly over the last century, not necessarily over millennia, where it often involved selection and hybridization of like species. But for example, since at least the 1950s in North America and Europe, a very common crop genetic modification practice has involved intentionally exposing plant seeds to ionizing radiation or to mutagenic chemicals to randomly scramble the DNA. There are more than 2,000 documented varieties of what are called mutant varieties on the market in North America, Europe, and Asia. They are subject to zero federal or governmental regulation. The Union of Concerned Scientists has not once, to my knowledge, expressed any sort of concern about these products. Nevertheless, any plant geneticist worth salt will explain that these are far more risky because of their unpredictability and the random nature of the genetic modifications than our products of recombinant DNA technology. In fact, even a lot of the specific questions related even to things like the development of herbicide-tolerant weeds that the Union of Concerned Scientists raises questions about vis-a-vis genetically engineered plants occur very commonly with mutant varieties. We have an issue in which an unauthorized genetically engineered wheat variety was recently discovered growing in a farm field in Oregon. What no one seems to be talking about is that for the last 10 years we have had a product produced by the German chemical giant BASF, which is a mutant variety of herbicide-tolerant wheat growing broadly throughout North America, and the Union of Concerned Scientists seems to evince zero concern whatsoever. So what explains your lack of concern with technologies that are demonstrably more risky and your over-concern with applying things like the precautionary principle and extra regulation to a proven, more safe technology like recombinant DNA?
Okay, so I think because we have 10 minutes tops, what I'd like to do is take the next question or two, and then what we can do is respond to the questions that have come up. Who's the next? And I'm going to encourage people to have short comments, and if you have a question, let's get to the question.
Right, this will be short. Just first on the arbitrariness, I'm unaware of any policy principle that isn't arbitrarily applied on occasion. Whenever a trade association says they're interested in competition in a level playing field, you know that the last things they're interested in are competition in a level playing field. But the specific question I have is, you start off by saying that, although I'm very sympathetic with I'm an economist with Susan's sort of comments overall. Your first criticism of precautionary principle is that nobody knows what it is, and when I don't know what something is, I have a hard time knowing whether it's bad. Does the paper actually, despite what you started off with saying no one knows what it is, actually attempt to sort of back out from the historical record what it actually is, at least in practice, and then so that one can actually have something that one can talk about in front of oneself rather than saying we don't know what we're talking about, but we know it's bad?
Thank you.
I have two very quick points. One is that it seems to me that the key thing that we're talking about and kind of avoiding is the trigger. What is it that actually is the threshold or the tripwire that would invoke the precautionary principle? And I think that if you go back into the earliest statements of the precautionary principle, it was actually fairly clear that it was something that was destabilizing to society or sufficiently of large magnitude to have a fairly profound effect. And that leads into the second point, and that's not necessarily unreasonable for this reason, that if you look at the precautionary principle as an issue that's been kind of manufactured since that didn't kind of grow naturally, but it kind of became a football and became a reaction to the concern about it became a reaction to GMO. You can read it in a different way, kind of culturally and legalistic way, and that is that quite frankly, I think Monsanto really shoved it down people's throats. I think that you had a situation where there was a deep perception that that in the specific case of GMO, that it was kind of rammed down the throats of Europeans who have spent 500 years trying to figure out what a pure food and drug law should look like, and had come to a reasonable consensus. And Monsanto basically, using every legal means and certainly a lot of economic pressure, to sweep that all away. So from the point of view of the sort of recipient of the policy, it becomes, do you trust the decider? And a lot of the concern over or debate over the precautionary principle is actually mistrust of the decider in disguise. And I think Sally really hit the nail on the head about the question of how do you develop trust. I think that the European community can be forgiven for not particularly wanting Monsanto to dictate the future of its food policy based on past experience.
Well, I'm tempted to respond to the previous speaker. I guess it's probably not my job. I guess when I read Failure to Hear, the Union of Concerned Scientists report, and I really dug into the numbers, what I found was that of the yield over the 10 years that were examined in the report, they attributed about 12% of that yield to the biotechnology aspect, and the other 88% to breeding. And it seems to me that none of the technologies on the market were intended to increase yields. The fact that they did is actually surprisingly good. In the developing world, they've clearly increased yield. But if we're trying to feed 9 billion people, even that 12% is the difference between getting to 50% by 2050 and getting to 60% by 2050. I mean, it's the difference between getting there and not getting there. So it's important to keep everything on the table. And so my question would be, how do we address concerns of organizations like unions of concerned scientists in order to be able to answer their questions in a scientific way so that we can get this kind of consensus and move forward and not have the same discussion that we've been having for the last 15 years?
Mine's going to be very quick. It's frequently we talk about the precautionary principle that more time is required in order for a good decision to be made, but that time is rarely defined, exactly what that time is. And so I appreciate comments on how long is really necessary to prove safe.
Okay, so in terms of the program, I've got authorization that we can run over by 10 minutes. So what we're going to do is have answer session for the questions coming up, maybe a few more questions, and then Susan would like to make a few comments at the end. So we're going to run over until 20 to 5.
So a lot of great questions. So in terms of the person who asks, what is it? Nobody knows. That's our conclusion. But you know when it's being applied because it's a legal rule that is expressly invoked when it's applied. So you have no question knowing when it's applied, but it comes to all kinds of different conclusions depending who's applying it and how they're applying it. So we know what it is. It's basically an amorphous, undefined wild card that you can use it to justify whatever you want. And that leads into the second point of the arbitrariness. And so Greg Conkle talked about the mutated crops. I did my PhD looking at mutations from the same chemicals and radiation used to make these crops. And I can tell you, we looked at these chromosomes, we selected for the one mutation, and we had at least 50 per arm of other mutations, unlike the GM ones that have 0. So there's no question that if there's a risk issue, it's much higher for these non-GMO that get 0 regulation, as Greg was saying. So it makes no sense from a scientific perspective to apply this one set of standard. In terms of the trigger, let me give another example, organic foods. I'm not saying we should ban organic foods. I'm not saying we should apply the precautionary principle to organic foods unless we apply it to all foods. But take a look at organic foods right now. We just have 120 people in the United States who have hepatitis A from an organic food product. Could you imagine if that was a GM product? That'd be on the headlines of every newspaper, ban GM. Is there any ban organic talk? No. What happened when it killed 44 people in an organic plant in Germany? What happened when it killed those people? I mean, it got 3 people killed and a whole bunch of people sick from the spinach in the US. What happens to a whole series of studies have come out showing that organic foods have a higher frequency and concentration of a known carcinogen, mycotoxins. If that wasn't a GM food, that would be front page newspaper. But study after study comes out in the scientific literature saying organic foods have a higher level of a known human carcinogen at a higher level, and there's 0 talk about it. 0 talk of the precautionary principle to organic foods. I have a banker's box of articles of people who have been killed and harmed by organic foods. There's 0 for GM foods. And yet the organic food industry is spending millions of dollars to go after GM foods and apply the precautionary principle and more regulation. It makes no sense whatsoever from a scientific perspective. It's an absolute disgrace. And there's no talk of the precautionary principle to organic food. So if we want the precautionary principle, apply it to everything. Require organic foods to meet it. Require your cell phone to meet it. And see how long we require your car to meet it. And we'll have nothing and see how long people want to live with that kind of world.
Well, from a couple of the questions at least, it could very easily be that we unfairly turn this into a conversation around the Union of Concerned Scientists, and I want to make sure that I honor the actual forum here and stay focused on the precautionary principle and this paper. On your comment initially around our position on GE, I've just recommend 2 pieces of reading. First of all, the position that is described in this paper around what would be a reasonable way of assessing the risks of generic engineering technology is surprisingly parallel to a position that the Union of Concerned Scientists takes. As a matter of fact, and so I would commend that you have a look at that. You probably haven't had a chance since it is a new report, but on page 11, as I understand on the citation, based primarily on the analysis of Professor Pam Ronald Davis, there's a very nice layout of what is involved in parallel to your discussion, basically concluding that where you need to make an evaluation is how the specific recombinant package is actually deployed in its environmental context. Your comments may have been a little bit misplaced in terms of our position. We have absolutely no issue with the technology itself, but the commercial application of the technology and the type of agricultural system that it enables, that is actually more of the target of our critique.
But why only our DNA products?
Well,
and not other products with similar characteristics?
So in fact, I generated some of those myself in my own career in terms of breeding corn. So in my experience, the place where we applied this was in the development of the genetic variation. It is in essence was a way of increasing the speed of the efficiency of genetic variation, creating diversity so that then we could select from that in order to come up with improved cultivars. The difference with the genetic recombination technique that I think is really important to keep in mind is that here we're talking about introducing across the species barrier genetic combinations that have not existed before. So it's reasonable to ask what might be the risk due to that. Secondly, it's important to remember that there's a temporal dimension to this. In other words, is that there is now close to about 17 years or so of commercial experience, longer experience in terms of actually deploying the recombinant techniques themselves, which we did not have the benefit of at the beginning of the deployment of these techniques, so that when the precautionary principle is applied to these particular questions, it actually made tremendous sense, eminent sense to be asking those questions. So, as a couple of us have mentioned here, the passage of time in order to be able to develop the knowledge on the basis of which to make wise decisions is an important factor, and it's a part of the systemic consideration that I described.
We can have discussion maybe over the cookies and. Did you want to? I would, since nobody asked me a question. Yes, no, it's all right, I'm fine, especially given the questions that poor Ricardo got. I'm very fine that I didn't get it. I just want to, I should have done this at the beginning, but I just want to thank my team for all the work they did. So